Good evening, everyone. Kalisperasis. Greetings, and I hope you all enjoyed that song. Welcome to the Greek History and Culture Seminar Series brought to you by the Greek Community of Melbourne. This is our last seminar for the year. It has been quite a long year, expanded by the COVID pandemic. And thank you all for supporting us, supporting the seminar series during the course of the year. We will be taking a few months summer break, and we will be returning next February in 2021. And I hope you've all seen a copy of next year's program, which we've posted online, and it's also on the community's website. It's been quite a tumultuous week. This morning was saddened by the news of the death of Diego Maradona. But at the same time, all week, we've been on the battleground. You've probably all heard the news about the intention of La Trobe University to close down the Greek Studies department and a few other language departments as well. The humanities now have been under attack for quite a while in this country as well. And there's a campaign to mobilize all affected parties which are linked to the Greek language and the Greek community to get that decision sort of overturned. So there is a petition going around. Please sign it. The more signatures we have, the more letters that are written to the La Trobe University authorities. Every little pressure helps to get a favourable decision and to ensure that the Greek Studies Department is not closed at La Trobe. It's the only Greek Studies Department in Melbourne, and it'll be quite a shame to see it disappear. For those who have registered via Zoom for this seminar, towards the end, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and then I'll pose them to the speaker. For those who are following it through Facebook or YouTube, just post the questions there, and we'll try and pick them up from there as well. Okay, let's start with tonight's topic, which is art during the period of crisis in Greece. Why is great art so often born of suffering? What we know from history and psychology is that creativity and innovation arise in times of crisis. When our lives and our world undergo drastic changes, our minds change too, often opening up to a new level of our own creative potential. And there is actually a scientific term for this process. It's called post-traumatic growth. It is said that Isaac Newton came up with the theory of gravity, and Shakespeare wrote King Lear during times of plague. When Picasso painted Guernica in 1937, he was emitting a howl of rage against the bombing of Basque civilians, a rage against the barbarity of war. The relationship between stress and creativity is not necessarily a toxic one. Is there a relationship between negative affective experience and artistic creativity? For many artists, this negative frame of mind is necessary for artistic creative expression. The emerging negative psychological experiences offer artists certain kinds of insights that may not come to the surface under normal tranquil conditions. This is what we saw in Athens, in the street of Athens, with the decades-long economic crisis, which was conflated by other existing accompanying crises Greece was experiencing. The thriving art scene that evolved garnered international attention. And our speaker tonight, Dr. Karanicolas, was in Athens during this period. That's the subject of his seminar. He witnessed it firsthand and spent a year doing field research in the capital. A bit of background on our speaker tonight: Adelaide-born Dr. Karanicolas. He's a tutor at Adelaide University, teaching anthropology, international development, and criminology. He's also a professional musician and artist who has performed with artists around the world. Welcome, Johnny. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nick. So before I get into tonight's presentation, I'd just like to say a big thank you to all the organisers of this event and these events more generally, and to the Greek community of Melbourne. So ultimately, today's presentation is a story of resilience during a time of crisis and upheaval. And I think it suffices to say that everyone in Melbourne, in Greece, and pretty much the whole world has felt, that we've been in this kind of period of crisis over the last year, with all of these issues popping up based around the coronavirus, but also the economic and physical and emotional strains that that's caused. So I would just like to say a big thanks to everyone and for the resilience of this program to keep moving forwards and keep the community alive and engaged during this time. And, that really is that same ethos behind the alternative art scene that emerged during the Greek economic crisis in Athens. So I'm just going to share a PowerPoint with everybody, and I will be speaking to this. So, as Nick already said, I spent a year in Athens between 2015 and 2016, as well as numerous follow-up visits all the way through to earlier this year. So we got back from Athens in January, just before this all went down. So my research, took place during that year of field study, but it has certainly continued, and so has my engagement with artists. So you'll see some materials that sort of show the state of things as they stand today, as well as they did in 2015 and 2016, which was very much the height of a significant point of the financial crisis, and further heightened by the Syrian crisis and the refugee crisis. So the name of my dissertation is Art and Crisis on the Streets of Athens. And as you can see by this image behind me, the connection between art and crisis is very present in the tone of the art and the symbolism. So here we can see a businessman in pain, having lost all of the wealth or all of those material possessions or the security that many in Greece had felt they had earned over lifetimes of hard work, which was ripped away very suddenly during this crisis. So there's a few questions I'm going to be trying to answer today. And I look forward to hearing everybody's questions at the end of my presentation as well. So hopefully we're going to find out how and when did graffiti and street art arrive in Athens? Because when you're talking about art and crisis on the streets, it's very clear that graffiti and street art are some of the most visual and prominent forms of this within Athens. So we're going to talk about how this came to be, why it actually took root in Athens to such an extreme extent. As one of my artists that I was speaking with in Athens called it, Athens is a street art paradise. So we're going to see how that came to pass. We're going to talk about what the social function of art actually is. So what is all of this art in Athens actually doing? What's it trying to say? And how do people perceive it? And ultimately, we're going to see the extent to which times of hardship and crisis can actually be socially and culturally productive. So just a brief bit of context. We've already said a few things about this, but my fieldwork took place within a time of economic and social crisis. I'm not going to go into too much depth about the history or the background of the economic crisis. It's something that was looming in Greece for a long time. It was really accentuated by the global financial crisis. And it really revealed the ephemeral nature of our institutions. So the way things can topple over very easily, and everything we think or everything we know can change rather radically. But in amongst all of this social upheaval, in amongst the crisis, the stress, in amongst the riots and the protests, an art scene emerged. And it was a very, very unique art scene, a very unique time in history, and something that I believe is still developing today. So along with all of these negative aspects of the crisis, Athens emerged as a European hub of alternative arts. Within a time of crisis and economic strain, funding to the arts, to the humanities, as Nick also spoke about just before, are often the first things to be cut. It's happened so many times. It's happening here in Australia, and it certainly happened in Greece as well. So artists who are already lacking in support all around the world had a very hard time early on in the crisis, in the sense that a lot of the festivals or the few opportunities that they had for state funding were eradicated. So what this did is actually lead artists to explore unique ways of art production and dissemination. They moved away from traditional gallery spaces and art venues and started using what they had, which was the chaotic, unique, beautiful, and insane city of Athens. This led to the development of an enduring anti-institutional art scene, an art scene that developed without support, largely. Of course, there are certain institutions in Greece, and we'll speak about this a bit later. But nonetheless, it was really this radical element of the art scene that provoked the interest of the international art world. So particularly, we had other European nations like Germany, which is a renowned hub of art, such as Berlin, starting to take a lot of interest in Athens. However, a lack of faith amongst the Greek people for economic and governmental institutions, and this is sort of has historic roots to it that we'll also speak a bit about further. So, of course, Greece has undergone some, in the development of the modern nation, Greece has experienced a lot of betrayal amongst even its own people. We've had a terrible civil war. We've had corrupt governmental systems and institutions. And as a result, Greeks generally tend to be unwilling to trust governmental institutions. And particularly within the context of the crisis, where Germany was seen as one of the major antagonists, artists were very wary about welcoming these German institutions into Athens for fear of further exploitation. Here in this slide, you can see a work speaking about Documenta, which is a huge German art festival, one of the biggest in the world, based in Kassel in Germany. And for the first time in 2017, it split its exhibitions between Germany and Athens. And this caused a huge amount of contestation and resistance within Athens. So here one artist calls Documenta crapumenta and states the crisis of a commodity or the commodity of the crisis. So the fear was that these institutions were commodifying the Greek crisis, cashing in on it, using Athens as a kind of sexy urban backdrop to do their own art and to sort of continue on this neo-colonial path that the artists perceived was happening. So the first thing I want to talk about now is graffiti and street art. So as soon as you step off the plane in Athens, for those of you who have been, I've been to Athens with a lot of people for their first time, and it's always one of the same comments is, wow, how much street art, how much graffiti, how much vandalism can you possibly pack into one urban space? So, you know, there's seldom a wall in Athens without some kind of marking. Now, ancient graffiti has been around not only since ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So we have examples of graffiti in the Agora in Athens, with these sorts of informal inscriptions carved into the walls, professing love for someone or making jokes or even paying out political voices of the time. It can even be traced back to very, 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 very early periods of human history where we can see etchings in cave walls. So the idea of drawing on walls is nothing new, but the kind of graffiti we see in Athens today really comes from New York. So the modern style of graffiti developed in the 70s. There was obviously some kinds of graffiti prior to this, but in particular, we see within New York, within lower socioeconomic communities, the youth starting to use graffiti as a means of gaining visibility within the city by tagging their names on the walls. So funnily enough, graffiti actually started with a young Greek-American man called Dimitraki. So his tag was Taki 183. So he used his shortened sort of Greek nickname Taki and the number 183, which was the street he lived on. And in the early 70s, there was a newspaper article written about Taki 183. And this was one of the first times that graffiti tagging came to wider visibility. It soon became very popular amongst the youth, and people would tag their names on increasingly dangerous and illegal areas, such as trains. So this is an image of Taki 183's tag on a train in the New York subway system. Now, from this, we saw that another emergent form of art was coming out of these same kinds of neighborhoods, which was hip hop culture and hip hop music. So this was another kind of subversive music form, largely within Black communities. And very quickly, graffiti became the sort of visual manifestation of that music. And that is actually how it transferred over to Greece in the 80s. So there's a theorist who has written a lot about globalization called Appadurai, and he explains two kinds of globalization that's responsible for the movement of ideas and can be very useful for when trying to understand how art moves. So one is this idea of mediascapes. So many artists I spoke to in Athens explained first coming across graffiti through materials associated with hip hop culture. So they would watch MTV or they would look at videos or magazines, and they would see that behind all of these hip hop artists, there was this kind of graffiti. Prior to that, the only kind of wall markings that they remember seeing in Athens had to do with soccer. So you can see this example on my slide of Athens 7. So that's a Olympiakos work there. So it was mainly there to mark different neighborhoods and different areas based on soccer teams. So one of the graffiti artists that I spoke to called Tuio had this to say about it. Back then in the 80s and even further back, it was the trend to write something and then write the number of your football team. For example, Olympiakos had number 7, Panathinaikos had number 13. Someone would write, for example, Argyris 13 or Charis 7. There was lots of it. But then, as hip-hop culture started to gain traction, via these mediascapes, so this global flow of media, which really took off in a significant way in the 1980s, we saw the New York style beginning to be reappropriated by crews and high school children in Athens. So the bottom right-hand picture is an image of that typical New York style graffiti. It evolved from using markers and pens into this bigger kinds of lettering that have that hip hop aesthetic. And they also made use of spray cans. So they allowed them to cover more walls in a quicker time as they started doing more risky spots. So of this idea of mediascapes, a couple of what are considered some of the earliest New York style graffiti writers in Athens had this to say. So this is Gorthios, that's his graffiti name. He said, back then, we didn't have smartphones or laptops or Facebook. We were but kids when we first heard the sounds of hip hop and rap on the radio or from friends who had the first copies of this music in Greece. We were hooked to our TVs watching documentaries about graffiti, and those who were lucky enough to own a video recorder could watch them again and again. So we made our first pieces. Another graffiti writer stated, I started doing graffiti at the end of '93, influenced by hip hop culture. As soon as I saw graffiti in hip hop video clips and in some movies like Beat Street, Wild Style, and Style Wars, I fell in love with it and started doing it non-stop. So you can see that graffiti within Athens has its roots within this New York style. Another aspect that helped it transfer is Ethnoscape. So of course, in the 1980s, the world generally in Europe saw a rising middle class. We saw more people starting to be able to afford to travel. As New York had quite a significant Greek diaspora, there was quite a bit of movement between those two, Athens and New York, which simply could bring those styles back with people who would see it over there, come back to Athens and once again reappropriate it. So I would like just to share this quote by Grigoris Valtinos, who's a Greek television and stage actor. When speaking about this, he told me, art is like seeds. It can leave from India, and if it finds a good climate and good earth, it will grow here as well. And as we go through today's seminar, we'll see how Athens provided that good earth for graffiti and street art to thrive. So we have this New York style graffiti, but we also see in Athens these works of street art. So we see these more complicated works, these works of art that could easily be at home within an art gallery. They're quite symbolically complex, they might be political in nature, and they take quite a significant amount of skill. So the move into street art was something that a lot of my participants described as transitional. So we had this introduction of graffiti, and what happened eventually is that artists that had trained or studied in other disciplines, so things like architecture, graphic design, or fine arts, so a lot of them came even from the Athens School of Fine Arts, they were inspired by the ethos of graffiti to start using their skills to create on the street. Because simply by creating something on the street, you're going to have it seen, if you're not a renowned artist, you're going to have it seen by a lot more people than you would if you simply create something in your house or your studio. So it's interesting to note that almost all the street artists I spoke to started off with illegal graffiti and then eventually started incorporating these other skills into street art. Now, there's been another push towards street art. It's that as this sort of art form has developed, artists have wanted to be able to express more symbolically potent messages within their work. And this is a need that has been greatly accentuated by the crisis, the need to express oneself politically. So of this, an Athenian street artist that goes by the name of B said, "The hope that existed before has been lost. And that created the need for artists to express themselves politically in whatever way they can. All this creativity can't be withheld. It can't help but go outwards." So just to sort of understand this movement and transition, I've got this little spectrum here. So on one side, on the extreme end, we see vandalism. Vandalism is generally considered by society to be illegitimate and deviant. And right on the right-hand side, we have what we consider to be art or fine art. So it's legitimized, it's legal, and can often be associated with art institutions or galleries. Now, graffiti sits closer to vandalism. So it really depends on the subjectivity of the individual as to whether they'll say that New York style graffiti is vandalism or an art form. Once we get into street art, more and more people start to consider it to be an art form, even if it is created illegally. And this definition has been further complicated by the fact that now street art is starting to be incorporated further into the formalized art world. And we can see some of the philosophical issues that play out within this through the work of Banksy. So Banksy is a famous street artist who creates work all around the world, and people will sometimes literally steal it off the wall and sell it for millions of dollars. Sorry. So it's a spectrum. Definitions are quite subjective. But it's also very important to note that most writers, regardless, begin with that sort of illegal element. It's something which is also simply thrilling. So for the youth in Athens, seeing other people creating works illegally can simply be exciting. So just of this whole conundrum here, I want to give you a few different perspectives. So I'm going to quote a few of the different artists that I spoke to. So Tuayo, a graffiti artist, said this: "It is difficult to say exactly what is and what isn't street art or graffiti, because everyone who creates something says it is whatever they want it to be. In the last few years, if you see street art on the street, it generally attracts people. Street art has a style with some political idea that all people can see and understand." So something else important is to understand that tags and graffiti have a kind of street code that is usually only decipherable by people within those communities, whereas street art uses political symbols that the more general public's able to understand. Now, a very differing perspective comes from the artist Fikos. Now, he also started with illegal graffiti and now creates murals, but he is completely against this kind of illegal street art. And of this, he said, "Street art is one thing and graffiti is another." He then told me that the creation of street art has sort of become a fad during the crisis, and, begin quote, "Any kid can do anything he wants on the street with little practice or no talent," end quote. He felt that, begin quote, "the better street artists do more murals, something bigger and cleaner, rather than going out and doing something illegal. The city now looks like a war zone with the graffiti and vandalism everywhere." So you can see the social perceptions and the way things are considered on this spectrum of graffiti and street art differs even amongst the artists themselves. So this is an image I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to that brings a lot of these ideas we've discussed so far together. Here you can see the breakdance associated with hip hop style of graffiti. Behind the rebetiko musicians, you can see New York styled graffiti letters. And you can see how some of it is in blue, this sort of modern hip hop style color, and the rest is sepia tone, linked to this image of the rebetes. So this image is a classic photo from Piraeus. I can't remember the exact date, but I would say it's about 100 years old, if not more. And it connects the rebetiko lifestyle. So for periods of time, rebetiko music was shunned. It was considered to be deviant. It was even made illegal at certain times of Greek history. And in the same way, today, this person is drawing the connection to graffiti, which is, once again, a radical underground kind of art form. So you can see those connections between that initial New York style and how it's been reappropriated to the specific historical context of Greece. Here's a couple of further examples of some of the kinds of street art you see and some of the places they create it. So on the left, this is a work by an artist called B. B started as an illegal street artist and eventually started doing these very pastel kinds of works. He now actually works in a studio and is a successful artist internationally. So he described that he lives in Athens, he creates in Athens, but he makes his money by selling internationally, and he's actually done quite well for himself. So that's actually quite a rare case to break through from street art into a sort of more commercial form of art practice. On the right is a photo I took during a street art session. So there's a couple artists here, and you can once again see the fusion and the crossover between graffiti and street art. So on the right, we have a work of what I think would probably uncontroversially say is street art. And on the left, we have that kind of New York style lettering again. So these things are always intertwined. They don't exist in and of themselves. So it's very problematic when we say we love street art but hate graffiti or something like that, because the two practices are absolutely not exclusive. They exist and have evolved side by side. And this is a beautiful work by Ficus. So he is that artist that I told you started off illegally, but now absolutely hates graffiti street art. And he did tell me that once he paints something on the wall, he takes a photo of it because he knows that in Athens, in his opinion, people don't have respect and it'll be destroyed immediately. And when I spoke to him, he said this, I quote, "Look, I started from graffiti and then I saw what street artists did. It had started after 2000. From 2005 or 6, there were 5 or 6 people who did very good street art in areas like City." So Ficus is very much a perfectionist. You know, there were certainly more than 5 or 6 people at that time doing street art, but he is very selective to only pick those who you know, have that really next level of artistic merit. So once again, even the artists don't have a consensus on what is or what isn't street art, what is and what isn't graffiti. Ficus is inspired by Byzantine style painting and had actually studied it. So once again, you can see how the evolution of graffiti and street art has led to some very unique forms of artistic practice that are very specific to Greece itself. And here's a few public reactions to street art. So this first quote is from Costa Spirionis. So he's a well-established artist, and he also curates the National War Museum in Athens. So when I asked him about graffiti and street art more generally, he lumped it into a single category and said this. He's actually a very funny guy. I can really hear his voice when I read this quote. It's very freaky. I don't like it at all. They dirty everything. I want to see the old houses as old houses. Why do they have to draw on them? I don't like that at all. It's very ugly and annoying. They dirty everything, whatever they can find. If they find an electricity box, they'll draw on it. Why do they have to do that? Another artist I spoke to said this: the council doesn't look after the streets. The youth feel entitled to graffiti and scribble over everything. So this goes to the sort of criminological idea of the broken window theory, which is that if you leave neighborhoods into disrepair, they will attract crime. Another one said, people know the political issues. They know the crisis. Art doesn't always have to remind them of that. It should take them away from the reality of the issues. So this particular artist was a performance artist, and they didn't actually mind street art, but they had an issue with the political element of it. They said that it should simply be to beautify space. Another one called it shameless self-advertisement, specifically talking about those kinds of tags that write people's names. And furthermore, so this last quote again is the Ficus quote that calls Athens a war zone. And he makes the note that you don't see it like that in other European countries or America. He's traveled quite a bit and he likes clean cities, so he doesn't like the way Athens is. Now, here's a couple really nice images, particularly this, our image is very famous. It's a work of street art. It was actually painted within a street art festival, so it was done legally. And it's probably one of the most famous images of street art within Athens. And a few years ago, it was actually vandalized. So someone got pink paint and wrote the word viral all over it. Who knows, maybe they were predicting the coronavirus, but I think it had to do more so with the fact that their vandalism would make this image that had gone viral online go viral again, but for a very different reason. Nonetheless, a group of artists that have studied the preservation of ancient art actually went and redid this piece. So they fixed it up, and this is after the vandalism, this image. So it actually has been restored to its former self. And here we have an image by an artist that I spent quite a lot of time with called Alone 98. So these are their graffiti names, because a lot of them work illegally, so they don't use their first names. And he was still a graffiti artist, but also did a lot of street art. This is an image with the Greek flag and the sharks that speaks a lot about the crisis. So It sort of looks at these, the sharks of the European financial institutions circling around Greece. And he was telling me that it was really interesting to him that some sort of anarchist tagger wrote ACAB and the anarchist sign over the Greek flag, because obviously anarchists have an aversion towards symbols of the state. But he was just saying that it's interesting because, this wasn't necessarily a nationalistic piece, but rather, a sort of symbolic piece about the crisis. And he said this, I quote, "Vandals don't see the art. They don't take the time to understand it. They see a Greek flag and they draw over it." So everyone has their own definition of who is and who isn't a vandal. Now, earlier on, if you recall, I showed you a picture of a factory. This actually happened just a few days ago. So there's this factory in Athens called Columbia, and it's for many years, perhaps even a decade or more, it's been a place that some of the most famous street artists go and they paint, they collaborate, and they work on their sort of style. Now, walking through this place, it's like this post-apocalyptic gallery with the most amazing works of art. Someone went and with a paint roller and paint did this over every single work. So it's a multi-story building. It had works of street art on every single wall, on the roof, inside, outside. And somehow they took the time to erase all of them. So once again, this has been generally condemned by the street art community in Athens, but it does raise those questions about what is and what isn't acceptable or unacceptable behavior. So there's certainly some kinds of codes. People understand that street art is ephemeral, and often if someone goes over their work with another work of street art, they won't be offended. They understand it's inevitable, but they consider this kind of an attack to be senseless. So now I want to answer that next question I had sort of raised earlier on, which is why Athens? So obviously we get how street art came to Athens, but what's so unique about Athens that made it take off to such an extreme extent? So one of the main factors is the spatial composition of the city. So once again, one of the artists I spoke to called Athens a street art paradise. So to understand why it is a street art paradise, I want to briefly explain how we got from the image on the left of Athens in the 1880s to the image of the right. So this is an image we took in 2017. At the time, I didn't have a clue that it was actually from the exact same angle as this old sort of illustration of Athens. So there you can see Parliament, and in the image on the right, you can also see Parliament and the Acropolis Hill in the backdrop. So you can see that the urban sprawl has increased radically over the last many years. So after the Greek Revolution, which took place between 1821 and 1832, sorry, there's a typo there. It's estimated, but not sure, that the population of Athens was anywhere between 6,000 to 12,000. After the assassination of the first head of state, Kapodistrias, in 1831, the Bavarian Prince Otto was appointed the king of Greece. So coming out from this sort of period, we start to see our suspicion of these international institutions emerging. So it has this historical basis. Athens was appointed as the new capital city after Nafplion, and it was rebuilt by German designers who were obsessed or really influenced with the ideals of ancient Greece. So this is, the ancient Greece ideals and aesthetics influenced a lot of European Enlightenment thinkers. So they wanted to rebuild Athens in a neoclassical style reminiscent of its sort of glorious Hellenistic ancient past. But there was an issue with all this, is that following the First World War, we had this huge population expansion, which was strained further by the refugees, the Greek-speaking refugees from Asia Minor, of which 500,000 settled directly in Athens between 1922 and 1923. So this huge increase in population created districts outside of urban plans and melded Athens and Piraeus into a single urban entity. Now, the city had a low gross density, and this meant it was extremely difficult to for utilities, for water, for garbage, for everything like that. So it led to the law on horizontal ownership, which encouraged multi-story building over single dwellings. Between 1930 and 1940, so it's this sort of interwar period, 450 apartment buildings were built in Athens. The next major phase of the city's development happened after the Second World War and the Civil War, where we had a doubling of the population of Athens yet again, with people migrating from rural areas in search of employment, particularly within the construction industry. And during this time, we had heaps of buildings, many that we still see today, constructed either illegally or with the kind of leniency based on the antiparochi system, which was introduced in 1959 in place of a welfare policy for state-funded housing. And what this system meant was that families that lived in single-family dwellings were encouraged to turn their land over to developers. Developers would then build multi-story apartment buildings and recompensate the family with a few apartments or a couple floors of the building. So this was beneficial to the developers because they didn't have to pay for the land, and it was beneficial for the families because they could secure housing or have an additional income by renting out the extra apartments. But what this actually did, this system supported by state tax privileges and a leniency towards illegal or makeshift and blasé sort of building practices, meant that the chaotic city shape that we see today has emerged. So this is an image of Athens from the balcony that I was living in whilst I was there. Now we can see the polykatikia, probably the most single definitive aspect of the modern Athens urban landscape. So the polykatikia is the Athenian apartment building. It's been, because of this lack of a sort of regulation at the time, the lack of city planning, the Athens skyline has become extremely chaotic. And you can see many beautiful dark walls and places for graffiti artists to begin their work within this context. So within this new spatial practice, we have high density living with very little private outdoor spaces. Usually it's just a small balcony. Sorry. We have limited public green spaces, which means that for most people, the city streets and their squares are the major sites of social interaction. So a lot of the youth, or even everyone really, can be seen out on the streets in Athens, hanging around the platia of their specific area. Different areas have different kinds of pastimes. It might include drinking. If you go to the platia in Exarchia, there might be music, people engaged in different kinds of recreational, illegal activities. If you go down to Theseo, there'll be music and people playing with the drums and dancing. So all of these public spaces have really emerged as an important area of social interaction. And as a result of this, public space has become a critical zone of contestation because control over it is symbolic of dominance in both physical and everyday life. So this is why different social groups work very hard to demarcate certain spaces. And of course, this is very visible in the radical left neighborhood of Exarchia, where the space is visibly marked off as a leftist or an anarchist neighborhood, particularly through the use of, you guessed it, graffiti and street art. Public spaces have become highly politicized. They've become sites of oppression, resistance, and protest. And this has been increased during the crisis. So you can see the amounts of protests, the amounts of clashes between the radical left and the far right, between the far right and the radical left and police. So it's all about trying to fight and earn this space, because space is so important in Athens for everyday life. So here's a few images of these clashes that took place whilst I was there in Athens. And we see this push towards people trying to reclaim public space. So of this, Anna, who was a theatre artist, said, and I quote, "Athens is a city that hasn't really organized its public space. There was a time like 7 years ago where groups started happening for the reclamation of public space. Athens as a city was never designed to have its parks. It just kind of happened as it was happening. It has no design, no urban planning. There was a point where people said, we live here, we need spaces outside, public spaces." So in these images, we have the image on the top left is Navarino Park in Exarchia. So this is actually a guerrilla park. The locals of Exarchia went to that park. They stopped it from being turned into some kind of, was it going to be some kind of shop or something like that, or a car park? And they made it into an urban green space illegally outside of city plans. They went there all together, they smashed all the concrete, and now you can find concerts that are hosted there. You can find it being a spot that people go to hang out with friends, and there's even a sort of vegetable garden there. The next two images, so the top right and the bottom left, are from communitism. So this is an abandoned, huge neoclassical building in Metaxurgio that an art group have literally taken over, and they use it to host events, art events, community groups that might be engaged in sort of programs or free education for the prosvigas, for the refugees and things like that. And the final image on the bottom right is a park that a bunch of graffiti and sort of hip hop artists decided one day was going to be the site of a festival. So a lot of these things are happening illegally, and this has that link to the development of the city and its space. So it's all about the reclamation of public space. Now, this reclamation happens symbolically. So graffiti and street art allow people to set the tones of their neighborhoods and allows a particular sentiment, the political sentiment of a given time, to be felt. And what's so powerful about graffiti and street art is that you don't have to be physically present to defend your space. The symbols speak enough. So this is all from Exarchia. You can see very clearly from these images that it's an anti-fascist, anti-authoritarian, radical left neighborhood. So the bottom right image, you can see AEK football club insignia, because AEK is associated, has many anarchist followers. It's considered to be an anti-fascist football club, and that's why they're part of that demarcation of Exarchia. So as you can see, the development of the city, the importance of public space, is one of the things that have created the basis for street art to have been reappropriated and to become such an important part of modern Athens. Now, not all spaces are so easily won symbolically. So here's some examples near Syntagma of actual battles over space playing out symbolically. So if you look, you can see the far right sign, so that sort of Celtic cross. You can see a Nazi symbol and XA for Chrysia Vgi, or Golden Dawn, which is the far right party in Greece. And then you can see underneath it things like anti-far zone, so anti-fascist zone, the anarchist A. And in the bottom right, we have this battle playing out during the time of the Macedonia issue, which was not too long ago. So it's an active process. Street art is very much alive, and it is constantly in flux and in tune to the city. Within Athens, you see all of these things playing out in real time. When I first got there at the time of the referendum to vote on the next bailout, it was amazing to see how quickly it visually permeated through the city. All of politics in Greece plays out very clearly on its walls, in Athens rather, particularly. So this is just to show that spaces are constantly contested and fought for, both physically and visually, through graffiti and street art. Now, we see these kinds of more simple symbols that are very easy to create and easy to understand. And then we also have the political power of street art to demarcate space and to spread messages. So here we can see a more complex, perhaps a more nuanced view. So often you'll find that the artists creating this work of street art are not radically aligned to a particular political group, but they deal more with nuanced social issues. So the image on the left of the flag was done by an artist called B, and it's symbolic of the drowning refugees during the Syrian refugee crisis. This was in Metaxurgio, this image. This image in the middle was in the neighborhood of Syria, and it's an image of Tsipras and Merkel seemingly engaged in what looks like a sort of romantic moment, about a kiss. And this is playing off an image that was drawn on the Berlin Wall of the head of state of Berlin and the Soviet Union at the time, who were painted engaged in a similar stance. So once again, art is constantly playing with history, playing with space, trying to reclaim space and trying to make a political statement. And finally, we have this image in Exarchia. This is done by the same artist, WD, who also painted the owl we saw earlier. And this is a homage to the homeless of Athens, who have, always struggled. Also a sort of homage to the homeless around the world. So street art allows these ideals to be broadcast to thousands of people, way more people than it would in a gallery. So in a gallery, obviously, you have to go through all of these different kinds of gatekeepers to get your work displayed. It can't be as responsive. It can't go up the next day after an event. So street art and the use of the streets allows people to be extremely responsive. Next slide. Another major factor that led to Athens becoming a street art paradise is the derelict spaces. So not purely as a result of the economic crisis, but certainly accentuated by it. A lot of the neoclassical buildings in Athens have been left to be completely derelict, because in many instances, owners aren't allowed to demolish them, but the costs of repair are far too high. So the best thing to do is to leave them in disrepair. As a result, there's a huge amount of these sort of black holes within the Athenian urban landscape, which creates walls and context for artists to create their works on, and even places for them to occupy. So on the right is open assembly that was happening during the Athens Biennale, which was an art event in a derelict hotel on Omonia Square. So you can see that the crisis and its effect on the spaces of Athens, as well as in many ways the difficulty of navigating many of the institutional elements of Greece, have led to these seemingly dead spaces. But it's always within these dead spaces that artists are able to thrive. And you can see a similar thing that occurred in Greenwich Village in New York in the sort of early to mid 20th century, where a lot of the lower socioeconomic classes moved to Greenwich Village because it had these abandoned factories and lots of lofts, and it became an art hub. It was, however, eventually gentrified and became some of the most expensive living areas in not only New York, but the world. Now, gentrification is a major issue and something that people in Athens are very worried about. So we'll speak about that very shortly. So with all of this going on, I don't want to keep you for too much longer. So if we are running out of time, please feel free to cut me off. But Athens has been called the new Berlin because Berlin emerged as a hub of art after the fall of the Berlin Wall. East Berlin was in economic ruin, and in a very similar way, it became home of these radical forms of art and street art. Nonetheless, within the modern crisis, the institutional art world is now looking to Athens. We've seen institutions like Documenta coming into Athens, trying to make use of its spaces, of the freedom of all of these kinds of derelict spaces and areas that it have, which are in many ways much more effective a backdrop for art than the very plain white walls of a standard gallery, which can feel very distancing. But in many instances, we've seen these forces of gentrification being resisted in Athens. So, oops, skipping ahead there. Because what people are afraid of is that they're going to be exploited, because they've seen it already starting to happen where these major international art institutions come into Athens. They make use of all of the hard groundwork that the Athenian artists did. And ultimately, the artists are expected to volunteer for free or are completely kept out of the final programs. So people are starting to feel that maybe some of these institutions are simply trying to recolonize Athens in a way, and they're linking this sentiment back to this tumultuous history we've had, particularly with Germany. So, as I spoke about the whole thing with the King Otto in the past, and these meddling of the European foreign powers, and more recently the economic crisis, which once again Germany was considered to be a major antagonist of. Now artists are starting to feel this within the art scene. And the pinnacle of this was when Documenta came. So one of the head artists that ran the Athens Biennale and was meant to actually be involved with Documenta, but got cut out very late in the piece, had this to say about it. Some people call it rape, some people call it romance. So relax and enjoy. I would say that there is definitely a lot of speculation, a lot of social mining here. There is a lot of colonial activity. On the other hand, there is an activist militia. There are all sorts of voices at work: activist, reactionary, exploitative, and all this comes together. It's this strange place that you can feel drawn to. It is in a flux. So this is a really good explanation. So on one hand, a lot of people, including other Athenian artists, condemned the really reactionary Athenian artists that took to this, this fear of exploitation, and they consider them to be acting irrational. And some of them have even said, this is the typical Greek irrationality, have xenophobia and not wanting foreign meddling, but you still want money and success. How's that going to happen? On the other hand, there's these voices that are really scared of being exploited, of being used by these international institutions. You have these different kinds of activists. So within the context of that Documenta festival, we had numerous counter festivals run at the same time as either a direct protest of Documenta or as a kind of mockery of it. So just to go back to this idea of Athens as being the new Berlin, I want to just say one more lengthy quote by an artist named James. I equate what is happening now between the periphery of Europe and the center a lot like what happened with Germany when it unified. There were two different economical systems, different modes of production completely, and they were made by force to unify. There was a committee that was in charge to make the economies in tune with each other so they could function as one country. But what that actually meant was bringing the East into the West. They made sure that they brought all the infrastructure of East Germany for nothing. I think exactly the same thing is happening here. Then you saw a boom of investment in East Germany, development and gentrification, and then the big explosion of Berlin happened. And suddenly, it is an international destination for culture. I think this is exactly what is happening now between Greece and Germany. That's what they are trying to do. They are trying to turn Greece into the West, in a sense. So once again, this is based on this idea of trying to create Greece in this image of the West. So earlier on, I spoke about the reconstruction of Greece by German architects in this sort of neoclassical style. And not only by Germans, of course, but largely instigated by this fascination with ancient Greece. So in the history of the modern Greek nation, there's been this huge push by European powers to create Greece in this idealized image that they want. Whereas really we see Greece is a really unique place. It's the center where East meets West. And it has this amazing sort of uniqueness about it that in some ways is trying to be tamed or exploited. And this is the image here is sort of playing on this idea. Instead of saying Athens is the new Berlin, a very famous Greek street artist says Berlin is the new Athens. This is a work done by that very same artist, playing on the idea of the Axis occupation during the Second World War. And they're saying that back then, so τότε με tanks, τώρα με banks. So back then, the Axis occupation happened with tanks during the Second World War, and now Germany and the EU is trying to take Greece with banks instead of tanks. Oops. What am I doing? Sorry. Just got one more little slide. There we go. So this is, let me just get my screen share back up. Great. So these are just some of the sort of critiques that appeared visually in Athens about Documentus. As I said, anything that happens in Athens happens on its walls. It's absolutely amazing. The city, the space, the walls are alive. And all of these factors are what have created Athens as a paradise for graffiti and street art. So it's extremely reactive and responsive to everything that's occurring. So in conclusion, Athens and its unique socio-political and spatial context are what have created a graffiti paradise. So it's the development of the city itself, the amount of walls and chaotic spaces. It's this general lack of policing or willingness to turn a blind eye to certain kinds of illegal practices. It's this inherent historically based resistance amongst the Greek people. It's this reactionary activist aspects of sort of society. And of course, it's the crisis. So this need to create, this need to speak and have voices heard. And the walls are the best place for that. Vandalism, graffiti, and art are all intricately linked. And the perceptions of these different kinds of art forms are very subjective, heterogeneous, and complex. The push towards this anti-institutional art within Athens goes beyond now graffiti and street art. So we see all of these different forms of art practices and art groups being inspired by the use of public space, making use of decaying urban buildings, and moving away from institutional art. So we see, this because of the amount of vacant buildings. We see it because of a lack of work. More people have time to actually create works of art. People are disillusioned with the way things are. There's political unrest. There's this isolation from institutions, and of course, the ever-present need for self-expression. Increased international attention has been a subject of contestation and even a target of extreme resistance within Athens. And there's lots of examples of this, Documenta being one of the most significant. There's also the issue with the Athens Epidavros festival that happened a few years back. So anyone that wants to read further into it, you can see what happened with the Belgian artist Jan Faber within the context of the Athens Epidavros festival. But nonetheless, in the face of the trials and tribulations of the crisis, the capacity of resilient Athenian artists to sustain a vibrant, diverse, and autonomous art scene stands as a testament to their willpower, creativity, and determination to be heard. Thank you very much for listening, everybody.
Thank you, Johnny, for that fascinating presentation. And I'm sure when all of us are able to travel and back roaming the streets of Athens, we'll be much more conscious of what's been painted on its walls. We've got a few questions, but let me just start off the questioning. I take your point that the tipping point between graffiti and art is very subjective, but on the topic of graffiti, especially in post-junta or post-1974 Greece, partisan political graffiti has been everywhere and not just sort of Athens. At the same time, during the crisis, society has sort of lost faith in the mainstream political parties as well. So in the process, have you seen less of that graffiti, or have you seen artists take over the space or paint over that space? What have been your observations on?
Yeah, so do you mean less of that New York style lettering graffiti and more political style graffiti? Is that?
No, I mean partisan political graffiti promoting the mainstream political parties.
Oh, okay, yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's way less of that. So within the crisis, there is almost no graffiti promoting mainstream political parties. And in fact, what you find when it comes to graffiti, or particularly with street art, most, if not every single artist I spoke to, when I said, what political ideology or group do you align with? They all said that they do not align themselves with a specific ideology. Most of them would say something like, they believe in the freedom of expression and, the capacity for people to be self-determined in their life. Most of them, were what's the word, I guess, maybe left-leaning, but in absolutely no way in the sense of the political left, more so that sort of culture of left-leaning, so inclusivity and all of these ideals. But certainly you're very correct to make that assumption. So the faith in mainstream politics has dwindled big time. The only thing you did see prior to the referendum in 2015 was citizen graffiti, because some people felt that this was a sort of new hope for the nation. But following the referendum, where a lot of those people felt the party sort of fell back into that traditional system, that kind of stopped.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few questions here. Start one with Paris Condoleon. I was wondering whether you have had much communication with artists or seen what the impact of COVID has been on the street art in Greece. So basically the COVID impact on the street art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have had some contact with artists, and actually recently one of the artists that I worked with quite a lot, he's a performance artist that would often use the streets in his art. He actually had an exhibition in the Benaki art gallery. So there are still things happening, albeit he incorporated the masks into the work because everyone had to wear a mask. Now, as this was prior though to the severe lockdown now, so within the context of what we're seeing at the moment, I would say that it certainly has stopped movement, and not only the creation of art, but the consumption of art as well, because obviously a big part of what was happening was that people were traveling from overseas, particularly from around the European Union, to Athens, particularly to engage themselves in this art scene, and that has certainly been affected badly by COVID. So COVID's going to pose a whole new set of challenges, but look, artists are a resilient bunch. So when I was speaking to one particular artist, she had told me that even though artists technically have been hit really hard by the crisis, so this was back talking about the economic crisis, they deal with it better than anyone because artists are in a perpetual state of crisis. Artists are never not in crisis.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got a question from Margarita Kefalaki. Should, in your view, graffiti be legalized as a formal art expression? Would this promote the correct graffiti to be exposed and prohibit people from destroying this kind of art?
Yep, so that's a really good question. So with that recent event that I showed everybody where they had gone to the factory and destroyed all of those artworks, people are pushing for this, so to have some kind of, you know, protection or acknowledgement of this art form. But it becomes hugely problematic and difficult. So what we have is, you know, if we go look in Melbourne at like Hosier Lane, for instance, so that's a sort of famous laneway in Melbourne. I'm sure most of you probably have heard of it. And what happened on a small scale, you can see gentrification playing out there. And you've got like things like Culture King, which is like a street store, but it's huge. And they've got this graffiti that they've done there. But for them, they don't want anyone to touch it now because it's their store. So the problem with protection is that often within our current systems, it becomes commercialization. And commercialization kills the initial capacity for artists to get out there and start creating. So one of the reasons why Athens has the amazing work of street art is because it has so many opportunities for young artists who might be terrible as they start off to actually get out there and create works. Because no one's going to commission a young street artist. When you live in an apartment in a city, there's also nowhere for you to practice street art other than illegally on the streets. So in some ways, definitely, I think, you know, works of street art should be acknowledged as art because they are art, but it is a really problematic thing, and I don't see an answer to it. Because on the one hand, the amazing street art couldn't exist without these early kinds of more primitive forms of graffiti. Nonetheless, certainly there are certain kinds of vandalism that you can see is simply there to destroy art, not making any attempt to be anything other than destructive. Others might argue that destruction is a form of creation in itself. So it's actually a very philosophical question there, to which I can't give an exact answer, unfortunately, but they're my thoughts about how I would start thinking about it nonetheless.
We've got another question from Paris. Did you witness much street art being drawn whilst you were there? What did you think of that process? And was it usually drawn over by better art or even graffiti?
Yeah, so I spent you know, quite a few days or nights watching artists creating and painting. So as I said, in that factory that was desecrated recently, I spent a whole day there with a few of the artists creating. So one of the things that all of the artists say is that a huge part of it is the parea. So they'll often paint with friends. Some artists work alone, but very often it's about being with other people. It's a kind of socialization as well. And, you know, it's jovial, it's illegal, but they're joking, they're having fun. They know that depending on what you're painting, the consequences in Greece, especially at the time, it may have changed now with the change of government, but nonetheless, they're not incredibly severe unless you're actually painting a sort of significant building. But if you're in a sort of abandoned factory painting illegally, something like that, people are having a good time. They'll often have, you know, tsipuro or a few beers and will be painting. And it always gets paint over eventually. It's the, you know, ephemerality is the fact of street art. And generally artists acknowledge this. Some of the really significant works stand for quite a while. But if they get painted over with another work of street art comparable, people just sort of accept it. I guess when it's just a blatant attack of vandalism, certain artists will be, you know, find it offensive.
Also, Johnny, I've noticed in the last few years in Athens, a lot of their trains are painted with graffiti style art. Is that a recent initiative, or that's been occurring quite a while? Or?
Yes, no. So are you referring to the sort of illegal painting or
well, some that looks a bit more formal. It's not as
yeah. So anything sort of formalized is very recent. So as street art is becoming acknowledged as actually, you know, a cultural kind of capital in a sense. So something that a city can be proud of. There's more opportunities for commissioned works. But if we're talking about train painting in general, it goes back to the very, very early days. So trains were considered to be one of the most dangerous spots to paint. And in that early graffiti culture that sort of emerged in New York, one of the things that would create the most fame for an artist was to have your tag in the most dangerous and the most illegal spaces, of which trains were considered very high up. So in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, particularly in Athens, train painting had a whole lot of prestige within that graffiti community.
Okay, I've got a question here from Vicky Tsakonis. Are graffiti and street art gendered? Is it more men doing it, or is it both genders?
Yep, so it's absolutely more men at the moment. So in Athens, I would say 80% men for graffiti and street art. There's certainly some very prominent women street artists, but if we're just talking about numbers, it's definitely a male dominated domain. However, having said that, when we're talking about art of the street, there are other kinds of art now that are using the streets, which you see a much more equal distribution, or in fact, even more females. So one of those being a lot of the community groups. So when I spoke a bit about communitism that had sort of taken over that space in Metaxurgio, that big old neoclassical building, that's quite a massive operation, and the majority of the members of that team are female, and you see a lot of the sort of guerrilla theater teams are very sort of female led as well. So art on the street is not male dominated, but if we're talking about graffiti and street art, then yes, I would say it is still.
Okay, we'll finish with one more final question from Paris. What are your personal feelings about the blurring of lines between artists who work under commission as well as illegally? Does this make them less worthy, or in other words, their personal opinion less respected or valued or influential?
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing, and that goes back to that kind of spectrum that I showed. So a lot of people are turning away from the institutional art world for the fact that it's based on these value judgments by people who are called experts. So for instance, a Banksy work, it was decided to be worth millions of dollars because it got incorporated into the institutional art world, even though this particular artist is fighting against this, because it undermines the ethos of graffiti and street art, which is meant to be anti-institutional, anti-commercial. But nonetheless, there's been a problem, because what happens then is other people will take photos of their works, they'll sell them, they'll use them for logos and make merchandise. And then the artists are essentially being ripped off. So when we're talking about these things, certainly for most people, if you walk into a gallery, you are expecting to see art. So it's already in your head that what's in there is art, even if it's simply, you know, postmodern canvas with one dab of paint. You're told by walking into this establishment that you're going to see art. The city is not inherently an art space. So whenever we see something there, it's going to become a value judgment on the individual as to whether something is art, whether it's an eyesore, whether it's a masterpiece, or whether it's complete vandalism. And this is one of the really powerful things about graffiti, though, is that the symbolic nature of it speaks because it's contestable. So symbols, to be able to have a true meaning, need to be contested.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your presentation again. I hope post-PhD you will be continuing this research. I don't know what's in store, and hopefully we can have you back for part 2 at some stage in the future, Johnny. Best of luck with your further studies and research and your artistic endeavours. Also, I wish everyone a great summer and great sort of festive season, and hope to see you back here next year at the Greek with the Greek community. Thank you everyone for participating again, and Johnny, thanks once again.
Thank you so much for having me.